talk about restorative economy, where it is focused on maintaining environmental balance while ensuring economic activities meet the basic needs of all individuals. Restorative economy also promotes ecosystem restorations and enhances the social and cultural aspect of communities. Restorative economy has three key aspects, focusing on recovery by restoring ecosystems and improving conditions, prioritizing collective action with an emphasis on local communities, managing resources responsibly, and transforming human relationship with the nature to address poverty, inequality, to ensure peace and safety. Despite growing awareness of environmental concern, many countries have yet to fully integrate the restorative economy into their policy and budgets. To talk more about restorative economy and practice in Indonesia, we have Koalisi Ekonomi Membumi Executive Board Member Lishia Erza Budiman. Lishia, thank you so much for being here at Sea Today.
My pleasure.
So first of all, can you explain concept of restorative economy and how is it differs from traditional or sustainable economic models?
I think restorative economy is looking after the planetary boundaries, the boundaries that the environment can take, that the society can take. So it is about responsible economy. It is an alternative economic view that is happening around the world at the moment. But it's sometimes also used interchangeably with bioeconomy, with green economy. But with Indonesia, what we see as restorative economy is how we see their considerations on how the environment and the society has boundaries, like to the maximum capacity that they can grow, and then also the restorative, so like the renewable capacity of the earth itself. So when we see the crises that are happening at the moment, it's because we are going beyond those boundaries. So restorative is taking into account those boundaries that we have to work with.
All right, would you consider something like fixing it, or is it more like preventive?
Both, I think. So it's partly because of the damages that we're experiencing at the moment. There are work that we need to restore, so in terms of fixing what we've destroyed in the past. But also at the same time, we are building new ways of doing things and leveraging new technologies, new ways of producing and consuming, mitigating and adaptation measures for the society, and then preventing the same damages to happen in the future.
Now, can you give us like some example of like real thing that maybe already happened or is ongoing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. In Indonesia, when we see the bioeconomy or the restorative economy, we talk about downstreaming quite a lot. And in Indonesia, as well as Brazil, some of the areas in Africa, for example, we're looking at restorative economy in terms of how we include local communities, how we also include sort of local wisdoms into our production methods. In Indonesia, Walhi, for example, they have Ekonomi Nusantara, for example, where they are also taking into account, yes, there's a need for economic growth, economic development, but they're looking into specifically mostly on the natural management and governance of things. In Papua, for example, there's also Ekonusa that's looking into empowering indigenous communities into modern economy, but also taking into account the balance between environment, social livelihoods, and also the governance of these policies.
Okay, it was interesting that you mentioned Ekonusa. I follow them on their social media. Can you give us an example? I mean, I've seen like how they vocally mentioning about their what you call it, they're responsible, like what they harvest from the area, but how do they balance between what you mentioned, economy, and helping to keep the environment?
Sure. I think I'll take an example from what Chem is doing. So our collective action is putting together three things. First of all is the governance of different policies between economic policies, environmental policies, and then also social development as a combination. With this part of the work is we work with the government to also look at new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at whether the area needs protection, and if that area needs protection and it clashes with the community livelihood needs, then we would look at new models and new economic opportunities to develop without having to disturb that protected area. And the second part of the work is also working with investors and local SMEs in terms of how they can have financial resources, capability resources in that, so that even though they are local communities in what we call Tigate, so the remote areas, rural areas, sometimes they're in borderline areas, they're not excluded from the economy because they can make use of what's around them, and that activity needs to make business sense for the investors to be able to participate in that. And then the third thing that we do in terms of balancing between the environment and the social aspect of things is also taking into account that transition period where these communities sometimes need to adopt or relearn some of the things. In agriculture, for example, we used to have the indigenous knowledge, you look at the sky, you know when it's going to rain, but now that the seasons has changed, we also incorporate some of the new technologies where we call them climate smart or agri-smart, climate smart agriculture practices. So you use data to supplement the local indigenous wisdom. So all three of these activities, we bound them into one framework where we call it the VC3, so value chain collaboration model.
That's interesting. Now, earlier mentioned the restorative economy can help with poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation. Can you tell us more on how does restorative economy help on that?
Restorative economy also looks into the social equity of things. So it's not one particular stakeholder that's taking dominance over everything. So sometimes it is a tug of war between the stakeholders having economic interest, political interest, sometimes ideological interest. But when we look at restorative economy around the world, so Brazil has a good cacao practice, governance practice, for example, that takes into account that responsible economy, restorative principles into their practices in the cacao industry. Another one would be from Indonesia, when we look at how this can benefit even those that are disadvantaged at the moment, is by including them into the economy. Just because they live in forestry areas or coastal areas, for example, it doesn't mean that they are excluded from advanced technologies, from innovations that happen across the world. So when we look at restorative economy, when we see, say, for example, the need for biotechnology and biorefinery to be implemented into these practices, the traditional economy would be taking the resources out of the region into centers like Java or urban centers, where the technology implementation happens in these urban centers. But for restorative economy, we also look at how we bring these technologies into the rural areas. It doesn't mean that they need to be too far away from advancements and ways of doing things. And by taking these new approaches into the areas, by working as a value chain view of things, people can be included in different parts of the value chain. And by including them into different parts, they're also open to new opportunities which they can take forward in their own livelihoods and development. So the poverty aspect to this is not just economic poverty, but also in that knowledge and cultural enrichment that we can get from the local communities themselves.
All right. Now, in your view, what are the barriers to scaling restorative economy practices, especially here in Indonesia?
At the moment, the challenges that we're facing are the fragmentations of different practices and policies. We look at how Indonesian businesses are only about 14% connected to even domestic supply chains. And that's very, very small for small, medium enterprises. Globally, Indonesia is only included like maybe 4% of the SMEs, so it's very, very small. And the reason that these are small is the lack of coordination between the policymakers, the businesses, and the investor side of things. When we look at development of specific sectors and how we can make them into high value add, into connected supply chains, for example, with a view of economic growth, sometimes we look at it only from a very short-term view. The opening of new lands, for example, is highly debated. It's land tenure rights are debated over there. But what we fail to also identify is the time that is required for the business to run, for the business to invest and build the infrastructure, and then for the investor to have a time horizon that takes probably even more than 3 to 5 years. So the coordination between these stakeholders are fragmented at the moment, and that's what KEM is also trying to, I guess, convene and make sure that everybody talks to each other to have that streamlined approach.
Oh, that's nice. Sounds like you guys like the bridge between the SMEs and the people who make the decision and like the regulation and all that kind of stuff. Now, Koalisi Ekonomi Membumi is aimed at fostering the growth of Indonesian nature-based innovation ecosystem. Now, where do you connect three key, the actors, the business investor, as you mentioned, and the jurisdiction? How do you facilitate these factors to align their goals with sustainable principles?
Right. We work closely with government at central and also district level government. The Ministry of Investments, for example, has identified for this cluster of investments, the size of the investment required is almost $45 billion US. And so it is a huge amount, and we only look at extractive as like large, but actually the nature-based solutions are also needing investments, and that's quite significant. And so what we do is we make sure that when each of the regional governments have economic planning and also human development planning within their policy framework, is making sure that sustainability is also a pillar that they look at. Sometimes there are regulations that needs to be reformed. Sometimes there are ones that needs new parameters, some sandboxing in the policy side of things to make sure that these new opportunities can be captured at local level. So with that legal framework, what we do then is work with the businesses and then introduce to them different principles. It could be SDG related, it could be ESG related, and how the impact is measured within the business practices. And then with that, there's the business, there's the legal stability, the political stability and commitment that happens there. Investors will be looking at this and identifying the gaps for the next growth that they can participate in. So it could be in the equity side, it could be in new financial instruments with the financial institutions, for example. So these three connected would be every activity that you find within our collective action at KEM would be having these three components all together.
All right. So at KEM, the Koalisi Ekonomi Membumi, it looks like what you mentioned earlier, there's only 14 to 15% of the SMEs right now supplying to like all the businesses. Now, but it mentioned that you're trying to connect the raw material supplier, such as farmers, breeder, and fishermen, with businesses that process and improve product quality, and also connect businesses that sell product to consumers. Can you tell us more about
a little bit about that? So with the jurisdictions, the reason why we work on like a jurisdiction view and a supply chain view of things, each of the regions in Indonesia have very specific economic bases. Some of them are agriculture, forestry, some of them would be manufacturing, some of them would be coastal and marine. So with that, what we identify is the strength of that region itself. So we cannot have like a one-size-fits-all for all of the regions in Indonesia. And with these regions, they would have priority commodities that they would produce or naturally grows in the area or available in the area. These different commodities then would have a relationship whether they become raw materials once they are processed to different types of industries. With that industry tree or mapping, so we see how the value chain works along the way. So with that, what we do then is then trying to connect whether it's the needs of the industry. For example, we work with European communities, business communities and chambers that are looking at seaweed, for example. But with seaweed, what they need are a refined version of the seaweed, so it's not just raw material. With that, then we would look at, okay, when this is refined, what type of subproducts that they would need. So there would be byproducts, different, like for example, if it's cacao, it's the oleo butter, it could be the powder. So the different types of processing would need different types of investments as well. So these information gaps are something that we try also to cover by introducing these local businesses to the buyers, whether it's domestic or international. And then the gaps in terms of capability, licensing, that would be something that our enabling partners would be taking their roles there.
Now, you mentioned earlier, there's investors, there's also the jurisdictions, and then the investments. investment cannot come in only for 3 to 5 years because it probably takes time for the business to actually
Yeah.
get going. Now, how do you ensure that investors prioritize the long-term sustainability instead of just looking for like short terms and then like, all right, these need to be
Sure.
done? I mean, it's not only for the investor itself.
Yeah.
I mean, like the government also, they probably are only in the office for certain period of time, so
Yes.
they need to see some kind of thing going
Beyond that,
Yeah.
beyond that short term.
Yes.
Yes, so within the collective action, within the coalition, we have over 30 organizations. Some of them are institutional investors, some of them are equity investors, some of them are angel investors. The same with the pipeline organizations that we have. Some of them incubate larger organizations, larger SMEs, and smaller ones as well. So in terms of balancing between short and long, when we see challenges in, for example, water resource management is an area where it takes longer than 5 to 7 years of investment to be put in place. When we see there's a need for water resource management infrastructure put in place, then we would work with the partners that has that longer term horizon. And then within that, there's a partnership between the longer term and the short term. Whether it's how we structure the investment, how we structure the deals that happen among these businesses, what we see is having that collaborative effort. I mentioned earlier that sometimes the failure is that lack of coordination between the government, the investors, and also the businesses. It's because sometimes it takes more than just 2 years to build an infrastructure. And that could be taken by investor mandates that could have a longer term view, 20, 30 years kind of view. The government and also the state-owned enterprises will also have different mandate and different time horizon compared to the smaller ones. And we could even have some investors that are looking at only like 2 weeks or 4 weeks or even 8 weeks returns when it comes to working capital investment, for example. So what the coalition does, and the benefit of working with 30 plus organizations, is we get a view of how we can mix and match these different mandates at the same time.
All right. Now, what opportunities do you see for Indonesia to be a global leaders in sustainable supply chain practices?
It started also, I think, with the genesis of CAM itself. We came about at the time when we hosted the G20 summits in Indonesia. And at the time, we were also talking about how Indonesia could be a thought leader globally on sustainable development, on just transition, on nature-based solutions innovation. And the opportunity for Indonesia is, number one, we do have a wealth of natural resources, and we're not just talking about the critical minerals or the oil and gas industries, but we do have everything from plants to fish to everything within that archipelago that we live in. So as a basis resource, we do have a wealth, but what we do not have at the moment is that growth that looks after this resources that we have, and doing that in a responsible way so we can have a longer term effect. And we're talking about 50, 100 years into the future. So as an opportunity, we have, I think, 3 main sectors that we have. So the primary ones are, of course, the agriculture, fishery, forestry that we look at and we mention quite a lot. But then secondary to that are the processing of these natural resources for the value add, whether it's the extraction of certain components, for example. One example that we take is from some of the plant-based cellulose, for example. They can be used into medical equipment, they can be used into different products that we have. And then tertiary is also the services industry, which includes tourism. So if we can coordinate all these 3 different sectors and the levels of complexity in the investment, I think Indonesia could actually grow from this base of natural resources.
Well, that sounds hopeful and promising right there. All right, Lishia, thank you so much for sharing with us here on See Today. I hope I see you again, and hopefully all the work that you're doing, we can see it sooner than later. Although, as you mentioned, probably take more than 3 to 5 years. All right, that was our conversation on restorative economy and the practice in Indonesia for today's Business Talk. You can stay connected with us on Instagram, X, and YouTube. Our handle is @CTodayNews. We're also available online at ctodaynews.com. Let's stay connected.